Hello to all the attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and let Keavy, Rich, and Elvis introduce themselves. For me, I come from the role of being in the consultancy side on the assistant procurement side and digital ethics. So we'll be asking these guys some questions, putting them in the spot so we can learn from their errors rather than have to make our own. We know that the most expensive lessons are the ones that we don't get to learn from. So, having said that, Keavy, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Of course, Pablo, thanks so much for hosting today. My name is Keavy Murphy, and I'm currently serving as the Senior Director of Security at Starburst Data. And I'm really passionate about building security programs for startup companies and the small companies. And I'm just really excited to hear more today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Rich.
Thanks, Pablo. My name is Rich Cocchiara. I'm the Chief Innovation and Security Officer for CXO Expertise. We are a small advisory company advising CIOs and CISOs on areas particular to cyber resilience and emerging technologies. My background, I'm the former CISO for the New York City Department of Education and also a retired distinguished engineer for IBM in the area of resilience. Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you, Rich. Elvis, last but not least.
Thank you, Pablo. Yes, my name is Elvis Moreland. My background actually starts from a military background. So I started in electronic warfare and then moved into cybersecurity after Y2K, graced us with its presence. And then 9/11 happened, of course, and cybersecurity took off from there for both commercial and the defense sector. So I do specialize in the defense sector as well as government sectors to do consulting and training.
Thank you, Elvis. And for the attendees, please type any questions that you might have on the chat. We do have some topics that we're going to be circumventing through, but please, by all means, the tougher the question, the better. No pressure for our panelists. Keavy, I'm going to go at you first. So at the top of everyone's mind are the nation's state attacks right now. What would you say is the true, real threat for the ordinary organization? And from your position of experience, what are the few things that we're not hearing on the news, we're not hearing there, that unless you've been through these struggles, through these trials, you don't get to learn? How can you share some of your experience with the audience on what you're seeing from this end? Because not everybody, we don't really have time to keep up with all the news, what's happening, and to filter what is right, what is not right, what is buzz. What are your thoughts on that, Keavy?
Sure. So I think the kind of real question here is, are ordinary organizations going to be impacted? And I think a blanket answer to that is really, unfortunately, it depends. So I think something that is really wise to do is, if you're just in an ordinary organization and you're really not sure if kind of real world nation state attacks is going to be something you have to worry about, is to really start doing the maintenance of a risk register. So using some sort of format to be able to quantify the probability and the impact of external threats. And so that would include nation state attacks. There's plenty of formats available free online for you to do that. And I also think it's important to keep in mind for organizations that consider themselves ordinary that, just because you're a small company or because you're in a niche vertical doesn't mean that you're not going to be impacted. I know recently that Microsoft put out a report where they said that the US was actually the target of 46% of cyber attacks. So that's obviously a massive number, like that we are, I think, double than any other country that was a part of that research. So it's important for us to not assume that just because we're in an ordinary business or because we're not working as a governmental or agency or organization, not to assume that we're not going to be impacted. But if you can make some sort of risk register that allows you to really quantify probability times impact of external threats, you'll be in good shape.
Thank you, Casey. So, Rich, from the perspective of resiliency, right? Resiliency, in a way, is being able to forecast what may happen and just rank in the priority of the probability of happening, and then getting ready and ensuring that you're allocating the right resources for readiness. What is your perspective on that?
I think what we're finding is that, looking for every one of the potential threat vulnerabilities is a very difficult thing to do. You have to have a couple different approaches when you're looking at, cyber resilience. You're not only looking at the probability of potentially things happening, but you're also looking at what are you going to do during and after. A lot of times, we will continually look at potential threat registers and to see what vectors there might be that we should be concerned about. Obviously, depending upon the industry that you're in, is going to dictate a lot about what are the different types of vulnerabilities you should be concerned about. Radical difference between looking at it from a banking perspective, financial services versus education, and where things are coming from. All too often, though, we kind of look at things and we say, well, I don't have to worry about this because I'm in a certain industry. That's not really the case. You do have to be aware of the different types of vulnerabilities. Some are going to be ranked much higher. So if I'm in banking, I'm definitely going to be looking at some of those nation states who are looking to come in and potentially take any financial gain they might get from me. But then if I'm in education, I'm concerned very much even with the ransomware attacks because it's less financial and it's going to be more about, reputational risk. Shutting down an education system as large as something like the New York City Department of Education would have far-reaching consequences. So when I look at resilience, I look at the threats and then how am I going to quickly recover from it? And, when I look at resilience, I don't look at just the threats and the cybersecurity. I look at also the business continuity and the ability to recover quickly if I have to. So there's a lot of different things you got to look at, but definitely prioritizing what's more important to yourself is going to be an important factor in your risk profile and your risk strategy.
Rich, you mentioned reputation and risk, and today we see in many advisory boards and boards of directors, how do we prioritize the question, what is the right thing to do versus how do we explain what we do? And it's one of them has to take priority. So in your perspective, Rich, there coming in from risk versus reputation, what thoughts can you share on the best way to ensure that both of those are being upheld without compromising on either of them, right? Because we see the market, at the end of the day, it is your reputation that dictates growth or quote unquote right sizing in the market. But on the other hand is revenue at the end of the day on your quarterly meetings that sort of dictates a lot of that perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You could look at the reputation, you could look at the risks, and all too often people take a look at a CISO and they say, well, you're just trying to shut down everything. You're locking things down and I'm not able to do my business. And usually what I do is I attempt then to explain to them the potential impacts to reputation and to the business themselves. What is going to be the cost associated with any kind of a breach or any kind of an event? What's it going to cost you? And then overall, explain that to the board of directors. Communicating to the board or any kind of an executive is critically important in the roles that we play. And we have to, as Pablo, balance risk versus the reputation and be able to communicate the potential impacts in a way that those people can understand. We as technologists often look at things and say, well, everybody understands what I'm talking about, right? That's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Not true. Most boards of directors are not, techies. And so you've got to translate it into terms that they understand. So when you explain to them, here's the risk, here's what I need to do to fix it, and here's what's going to be the impact on your reputation if it should occur. And a lot of times we don't do that, and we need to do a better job at that. That's on us.
Yeah. And that is right. We're not just here to help with our hands on the controls, but also we're educators, right? We're to enable people to make sure that they can be self-supporting in a lot of these decisions and making sure that they don't need to be talking to someone before they start thinking, is this legal? Is this illegal? Is this right? Is this wrong? And to come at you, Elvis, you come in from a very, very unique background, very unique perspective from the military side. You sort of have a perspective that, in a way, most of us will never be exposed to. What can you share on what you can see from the outside? Because you work with very, very closely, randomly in a way, with all levels of an organization, the in-between man and sometimes the perpetrators. What are the things that you see that people in our role don't usually get to see unless we're working with you?
I do see a lot lately that we're using terminology, I think, that catches ideas, it catches attention. But when it comes back to what we really need to do as professionals, and I agree with Rich and Keavy both, that looking at it from a perspective of, are you addressing the fundamentals? Are you aware of your environment? Are you even aware that you have exposure at different internet connections that you might not know about? I did sit down and talk to a small manufacturing company, and they didn't know that they had 3 additional entry points to the internet that was not documented. We found those by doing a risk assessment. So,
what size organization was this?
I'm sorry?
What size of an organization was this?
This was about 25, in the 20 employee range, and they weren't very big, but they did rely a lot on their production. So that's a business that if they were impacted on the production floor, that would have had a direct impact to the bottom line.
Are those the fundamentals that you think get missed the most?
Yes, I think they do, because we do get overwhelmed with what's coming at us on a daily basis. We talk about zero trust. We talk about user business and UBA, okay, user behavioral analysis. We talk about SIM. We talk about CASB. We talk about cloud. We use a lot of terminology, not a lot of value to a business leader or business decision maker that really needs to understand this from a layman's term. And I think we could do better.
Yeah, Elvis, I have to agree with you. And I think Keavy touched on this, the whole idea of the risk register and understanding
Yes.
in there and comparing it to what the business is finding acceptable. You know, as you said, we don't translate real well. We got to get better at that. We need to put it in terms that the business can understand, so that they understand this is going to impact my production line. If it impacts the production line, this is what's going to result going to be to your business. And, you know, bridging that gap, making sure that we translate our technical needs into business needs is critically important. And I find that having that regular meeting with the executives, it could be a monthly, quarterly, but producing a report and being consistent, because that's what, you know, you don't want to keep educating them constantly. You want to say, this is what I'm going to show you. It's going to be like this every month or every quarter, and you're going to see trending, and I'm going to show you what's going on, and I'm going to show you the impacts and what we've prevented. I found that to be one of the most important things, is to tell somebody, based on what we've done, here's what we've prevented so far. And, you know, when you're talking about preventing millions of incursions into a school system, that's a pretty powerful statement to tell the chancellor.
Yeah, you're talking about lagging indicators too, Rich, that you know, many organizations have not built into the fundamentals. You know, do we have that metrics capability? And I think that's a level of maturity that some places in the market just they haven't gotten there yet. And I'm seeing that across the defense industrial base. They really do not have a level 1 or level 2 maturity level. So they really don't have that capability to recognize trends.
And we have a question on the chat actually about those gaps, right? The question that we have is, what are the recommendations to help bridge this gap and the appropriate focus on the fundamentals? Now, whether you look at this from a board of directors, from a senior leadership, middle leadership, or sometimes the front lines, and also depends on what kind of board of directors. There was a major retailer that, this specific case, that filed for bankruptcy in the last 5 or 6 years. As soon as they filed for bankruptcy, within 6 months, their entire board of directors went from being technologists to a third of them were bankers, a third of them were attorneys, and a third of them were accountants. And this was a company that was in the billions of dollars of revenue, and the CIO was having to go to the board for anything over $50,000 worth of spend, which in this position, it's a round-off error for most projects. I'd like to hear from each one of you. What is your perspective on any of those levels that you'd like to hone in? And Keavy, privacy is seen, you probably, if you go and ask in a company at 4 different levels of an organization, how do they define privacy? My guess is that you're bound to find at least 3 different answers. And you're smirking. So what's behind that smirk? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it kind of goes back to what Rich was saying earlier, which is that you really have to speak the language of the business. So I always try and assume that each group I'm going to be talking to, whether that's finance or an engineering department, HR, et cetera, they're going to be speaking a very different language. And so it's my responsibility as a security professional to make sure that I'm translating the information coming from cybersecurity and the world of risk management and data privacy specifically to kind of their world. And so when I say speak the language of the business, I mean, always bring metrics, like bring data. That tends to be pretty universal. I know Rich and Elvis were talking about this, that if you can kind of, come with numbers and kind of come with data and show like what you actually prevented and what you want to prevent. So for example, if you need budget to ensure data privacy at your organization, it's good to be able to come with some sort of number that's going to indicate what you're going to be able to secure with that budget once you have their buy-in. But I think at the end of the day, the real best practice here, regardless of who you're speaking to about data privacy, is to really speak the language of the business by bringing numbers. Whatever metrics you can provide is really going to bolster your message, regardless of who's in the room.
Yeah, and I found that those metrics, and Elvis kind of talked about this, right? Who you presenting them to, right? How you present to a board is different than how you're presenting to your senior executives, and how you present to the masses. I always believe that sharing that information with the masses, because remember, one of the biggest issues we have is getting everybody to understand the value of cybersecurity and why they're a part of it, right? Everyone's saying, well, that's security. That's somebody else's responsibility. But if you get the employees understanding, look, this is what we're facing. This is the number of incursion attempts that happened this past month. This is what we did to protect your data. You. They all think it's something, I don't have to worry about it. It will be if they get your information. Right, your PII data, right? Personally identifiable information now becomes your problem. Make it everyone's concern. That's the key.
Elvis, coming from your perspective here, where you come in with it's sort of almost a back door on the discipline piece, right? Because it's at the end of the day, coming from the military background, you sometimes might not get pulled so much into revenue. Is this costly enough? Is there ROI on this? How do I ROI risk? And at the end of the day, right, it's how do I ROI a fence around my pool? And well, if your neighbor's child comes in and falls in your pool, then all of a sudden that made a lot of sense, right? How do you ROI the locks on your door? So Elvis, what are your thoughts there? Because I really like what Keavy and Rich sort of attributed here. You got to get to run the business, and you got to be maniacal about understanding the people that you serve. We know that learning something new or understanding people starts with a position of acknowledging ignorance, and pride gets in the way. One of the biggest misconceptions in this world, in my opinion, is that we look at personal vulnerability as a weakness. However, Elvis or Rich or Keavy, if I report to you and I'm doing work for you as my manager, my director, my executive, and I don't come to you and I mention, this is what I'm doing about this. I'm having these challenges. Am I looking at this right? Am I missing something? What are your thoughts on that, Elvis?
So beyond the fundamentals, once you address the fundamentals, and there's a good way to identify the fundamentals, just take a look at the 18 critical security controls. Our keynote speaker today came from CIS security. I think you can take a look at those fundamentals from a technical perspective. Then education, next step. And I agree with Rich and Keavy both. I think will add to this line of thinking. Is establishing a foundation is good. The next part is educating those people at each level that needs to be involved. The end users need to be involved. The management needs to be involved. And the board needs to be involved. And you're going to need to change your educational objectives for each level. Now, does that mean you go out and become or get an MBA? In some instances, I think security professionals should. But it does take effort, and it does take your own education to, as a security professional, to convey and communicate to your audience. And if you think it's valuable to go out and get an MBA, then so be it. I support that. But at least take some effort to educate yourself so that you're a better educator at that next level once you get into the education and educating the organization as to what security means and the bottom line.
Can we go a layer deeper in learning the business? Because now we're seeing that we know there is a negative unemployment rate on the cybersecurity side, which means that now folks that grew up specifically in the digital infrastructure side, now they're being thrown into security and learning the business, right? Because at the end of the day, the role of IT and cybersecurity is not to evolve. The role of IT and cybersecurity, the ultimate goal is to enable the business. All the board of directors wants to hear is, yes, we can do that, and yes, we can do it securely. However, learning the business, right? How do we understand what their KPIs are, how they get to those KPIs, what their missions are, what their goals are, what is causing friction on their day-to-day operation? And I'd like to hear each one of yours responses and approaches to that, to learning the business and being political internally in the organization. Now, I'm not saying all the way politically correct, because sometimes when you start thinking, you run the risk of hurting someone's feelings. And at the end of the day, we come into a conversation, we go perspective versus counter perspective. And respect is always in the middle, but we truly need to understand what we're working with. So, Keavy, if you want to get us started there, what are your thoughts here? What has been your experience? How has that evolved throughout the years?
Yeah, I find in terms of educating and kind of getting better business relationships with those outside of security really can be solved if you're willing to avoid this communication trap of kind of the security department being siloed. So I feel like a lot of times the security team only pops up when something goes wrong. So if there's a data breach or a security incident, here's the security team. But I think it's the responsibility of security managers and leaders in the industry to be able to teach their people to build relationships with other business units. And I find that can be a little bit tricky. I think that teaching soft skills is a lot harder to teach than technical skills in the security space. I think it's hard to kind of, as you said, learn vulnerability, and you mentioned that earlier, and kind of learn effective communication and kind of how to get your message across with people is really effective, but it can be difficult to learn. So I think that while it's definitely a challenge to be able to use your soft skills to build those business relationships, you want to do everything in your power as a security leader to make sure that your department's not siloed. They shouldn't just be appearing when something goes wrong. And I think that really all ties back to what we have been talking about during this presentation, is really speaking the language of the business, which of course, as we said, means bringing data. And I think that if you can really develop your direct reports to be able to build those relationships so that they're available and not siloed when something does go wrong, is really effective. So if you're encouraging the people in the security department to kind of have a 15-minute touch point with business leaders, whether they're in finance, whether they're in HR or customer support, et cetera, I think that's really, really valuable. We don't have to overcomplicate it. Just put 15 minutes on someone's calendar and make that business relationship strong so that when something does go wrong and there is perhaps a data breach or a security incident or a 0-day, people know who to go to and you're not siloed as a department.
And that's where it's important to be aligned with senior leadership, right? Where is the business going? So you can make sure you can understand the different departments and stakeholders from that perspective. So Rich, learning the business, what are your thoughts on that?
Critically important. I mean, I've operated in multiple different business environments, both business and government, two different things. I know we were saying before that it's, you shouldn't be political. In government, it's all political, right? It is. And so you having to understand what are the key drivers for that kind of a constituency. If I go in and I'm talking to somebody in government, I can't go in and say, well, look, I can help you grow market share. They're like, Rich, what are you talking to me about?
Wow.
But if I go in and say, I can help you reach your constituents better, more effectively, I could also ensure that your reputation, because the last thing you want as a politician is to be embarrassed, right? Completely different conversation. So understanding what their drivers are. You mentioned before KPIs. What are the KPIs for the industry or the business or government entity that you're talking to? Department of Education, it was all about making sure we could educate our students, right? KPI for them was how many students are in the classroom at any given moment. So, okay, let me show you how to do that. Let me show you how we can help protect them and enable you to continue to do that. Banking is going to be different. Everything is going to be a little different, understanding exactly what their drivers are so that you can then respond appropriately. So yes, I mean, do the research. It's not easy. Do the homework. Find out what are the key drivers for the company or the entity that you're dealing with. Develop KPIs that make sense to them, and then develop a communications mechanism, as Keavy said earlier, the metrics that are going to get them to understand, oh, I see this, I understand why this is important, and I understand why you're asking for certain things. So I think you have to understand the business.
And that isn't for our audience. I mean, to see that here, Rich, Keavy, and Elvis, they keep attributing to education, communication, enabling. We have to become master communicators. And at the end of the day, to excel at something is not just through the mechanics. The mechanics give you background, they give you a framework, but at the end of the day, nothing is going to propel you forward like passion. You can't fake passion. When you want to understand someone, it comes across. When you want to question someone, they can tell the difference between a conversation and an interrogation to look for what did you do wrong. And, Elvis, to come at you with this one. We talk bureaucracy doesn't just belong in government. It also belongs in big organizations. Sometimes you might have conflicting agendas within the same steering committee of stakeholders to approve that new initiative. Keavy and Rich, they touched on, the data, the metrics, cut through the fluff. Saying we need to improve cybersecurity. Yeah, okay. Now, how do you cut through that? Because sometimes that bureaucracy seems to be like a bigger beast on the government side, but you still got to get your results. You still got to report traction. What can you share?
So if you're working with the commercial company in the commercial industry, obviously, if you have access to the risk committee or someone who's a representative on the risk committee, that's who I would recommend you take your conversation to. Outside of that, in the government space, it's a little bit different. Rich kind of touched on this. It is reputation. It is, are you a good steward of the taxpayers' money? And if so, if you can show that you're effective in certain areas, like let's go with vulnerability management, for instance. I actually had an opportunity to talk to a municipality. They couldn't understand why their services were slowing down so much during the day at certain peak hours, because they didn't plan their network properly. Their perimeter devices were not up to speed, and they were being attacked at the same time. So if you take a look at services from a government perspective and what security means to assuring those services are available to the citizenship, to their constituents, then you have a talking point. On the commercial side, your talking points are more along the lines of, okay, is this going to be, if you don't do this, are regulators going to come in and find us? Yeah, are there going to be, press releases about becoming a member of the Wall of Shame, especially if you're in the healthcare sector? So you have to take a look at the business impacts and use or really kind of structure your approach to each environment, whether it's public or private. And if you could do that, and that's part of educating yourself about the business, then you can have a better conversation with decision makers throughout your tenure.
Is that what you're seeing? Go ahead, Rich.
I'm just going to comment on that. And Elvis, you touched on something that's critically important, is understanding the business impact. Okay. Yes. All too often we go in with generic terms, right? Hey, if we have this kind of a breach, this is, what's going to happen. But quantifying it, doing the upfront work, the planning part of it that says, we've done the analysis, this is the impact to these lines of business, to these different processes, having that, and then back to what Keavy said, being able to then put that into any kind of a report. So now, you're not going in with some generic thing. You're going in something very, very specific to the entity that you're talking to. You've given them specific numbers. You're showing them what you prevented. By preventing it, you can go back to and say, look, I prevented you from losing this amount of money. Helps to generate the kind of thinking around, I now need this additional funding to fix this other problem. I've always found that executives and boards are much more open to having a conversation about what additional needs the cybersecurity team has if I've been able to show them this is the value you got for what you gave us. And I think that's important.
And I'd like to jump in here. I think that Rich makes an excellent point, because as we say, we're bringing data, we're letting the business know what we're helping them avoid or what we're helping them prevent. And I like to think of it as kind of an option for you to not overcomplicate it. You don't need to bring a ton of numbers. You don't need to bring a crazy spreadsheet. I think it was IBM that said the average cost of a data breach is 4.24 million. That's one number. That's an easy number to internalize. You share just that one line, you're going to get buy-in. You don't have to bring too many numbers. Just bring a solid number that quantifies what you're trying to avoid, and you're going to be effective.
Be relevant with the data that you bring to the table, right? And that's one of the questions that we had discussed through, guys, is that what has been the biggest shift in the approaches to security within your customer base? So as you're learning your clients constantly, you're seeing that there is not really a one size fits all. So, and this for anyone to answer, what has been the biggest shift in the last 2-3 years that even with all your experiences put you back on your heels and made you think, wow, I did not expect this to go in this direction?
Well, the biggest
is that being a CISO, you got to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
I found that the CISO position is changed. Okay. It used to be, hey, just worry about the cybersecurity part of things.
That's right.
Now you're looking at a lot of different things, right? I'm looking at the business continuity, the disaster recovery. I'm looking at governance. I'm looking at privacy. It used to be CISO is a geek. That's it. Worry about firewalls, right? We were always just firewalls, right? Firewalls, antivirus. That's all you cared about, or at least that you were told to care about that. Now they see you more along the lines of, I don't want to say chief risk officer, but you're getting to that level. You're operating at a level even beyond the technology. And that's another key thing. We've moved beyond just talking about technology. Now we're operating at a level in which we're having conversations directly with the board. Okay, directly with the board. Where before, you would have found the CISO reporting up to the CTO or the CIO. Now it's reporting directly up to the board. It's on level, it's on par. Not in all places, but that's what I'm seeing is a shift to understanding the true totality of risk as opposed to just thinking of it as a technical issue.
I'd like to ask Keavy, maybe from her perspective, because you are specializing in smaller organizations, where have you seen this role come into play for cybersecurity?
I think the shift has really come, I think probably because of the news, it has really come to a place where data breaches are front of mind. So when I think about small businesses, I think for a long time, from a security perspective, we all really were under the impression that we were never going to be targeted, and that a startup or a scale up is never going to be impacted by a data breach. Like, why would a nation state actor or a malicious actor go after a small company? But the more research that's come out, I mean, Verizon does this really excellent annual data breach report. They publicized that 43% of all data breaches that had happened in the past year were targeted against small businesses, which is, of course, real world evidence that a small business can be targeted and can be impacted by a data breach. And so what I think has become top of mind then is the security departments now focus on protection of personal data as kind of the forefront and the model for how they're securing the company. Because when you really think about it, malicious actors, why do they try and get into your systems? Why do they try and infiltrate your organization? It's probably because you have personally identifying records. And so that's something that any company can have, regardless of size. Doesn't matter how many employees you have or how large your customer base is, you're going to likely hold some sort of personal record. And so therefore, that should indicate to you that as an organization, you are perhaps going to be the target of a data breach or inadvertent data disclosure. So I think that more than anything, the shift that I've seen in the small business space is that everybody is now more cognizant of data breaches, and they're because they're talked about more. We're seeing them in the news every day now, which is terrifying, but it also means that we kind of have our work cut out for us as security leaders.
And it never ceases to be terrifying. If you're doing the right thing that you're doing, you should be having terrifying for breakfast.
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise, I mean, this job is not for the faint of heart. You got blood pressure trouble. You really want to be in cyber?
Yep. Find another industry. Absolutely. Yep.
And there is a book. Go ahead.
I used to tell my team, look, you got to let me know what's happening, no matter what time of day or night, because I need to know when I'm taking the commute in on the train. Am I, going to be working on my resume that day, or am I going to be reading through my email? Just tell me which one I should be working on that day, because again, you don't know. And I gauged every day when I was a CISO at the DOE as to am I on the front cover of the New York Post? I just need to know. Check that first.
Right. So
and this is important because we're communicating. Go ahead, Elvis.
So one thing to think about is there's a common denominator here that I don't think we talk enough about. And if you have a business, and I'm not going to discriminate between big, small, large, whatever. If you have a business and you have a presence on the internet, then you should think about how that does impact your business from a day-to-day perspective. Because if you're a plumbing business and you can't get out to service your customers because your call system is down or your billing system is down, then that's a direct impact. And if you're a government entity like a city or even the state, then you could be impacted because you have an internet presence. So think about in terms of what's good for you and the business is you have an internet presence. Is it guarded properly? And really, is it protecting the business? Is it providing a good window for the world to use you as a business, or is it a risk?
So it comes down to, are you learning what you're doing? And one of the biggest challenges today, right? It's how do we communicate with the board? What do we communicate? How often do we communicate? Right. So we have the method, the cadence, and the content. You could have a 34-page PowerPoint and not say anything and say a lot more and say a lot less than the person that came in with a 4-bullet point PDF. So, and we see the problem that the technology piece tends to get overexposed. So what now, speaking to communicating with the board, establishing that cadence, what do you see the best approach to determining what the right approach is?
So I'll just speak up a little bit here. So I use standards that are proven, and a lot of people push one standard or another. If you're from IT, you know about COBIT and you know about ITIL. The practices in security are a little bit different, not as clear cut in black and white as an ITIL or COBIT. So if you use something like NIST, you're looking at system level security. That's where it's focused. If you're using a control set like ISO 27000, then you're looking at a management system. So it's a different approach. And both are complementary. In fact, I use them both together. But if you have the fundamentals down and then you're educating yourself first, and then you're educating those around you, then taking on the standards, I think, would be the next step that you need to look at. What kind of frameworks are you putting in place?
Yeah, that's the approach I always took, was that I like to be able to reference back to frameworks or standards, as Elvis said, because you're going to get that question. You're going to get that question. Rich, is this your opinion? My opinion based on these standards, based on this. You need to have a roadmap, and at least being able to utilize it gives you the ability to point backwards and then communicate it more effectively. Now, I'm going to go back to what Keavy said. You don't want to show up with, a bunch of different metrics or whatever. Simple stuff. I always liked putting just a picture together, a couple different charts of just graphs or pictures, because easily digestible, communicating it, and then tracking then back. Then they would ask, okay, take me to another level, Rich. Okay, here's how I came up with this. Let me take you below to the data part of it, and it's compared against these standards. So therefore, I'm using best practices, not just my opinion, best practices. So it points back to what Elvis just said.
And Keavy, I mean, you coming from the perspective on the medium-sized businesses, which is what you work with the most. Sometimes you don't have the luxury, and most companies don't have the luxury to look at the entire framework before they get going. And you got to start building the penthouse while you still haven't built the foundation of the house. And you got to be dynamic, and you got to be learning the business. And this is not a one-man pony show. I mean, it's everybody goes together, and the CISO, it's ensuring that also sometimes you got to come in, and maybe it's not you about learning a department, but you're realizing that operations and marketing are not talking to each other. And then you got to come in and be a corporate psychiatrist. So what have you seen on that end, Keavy, in regards to the skills that you have to have on communications, coming from the framework perspective, the enabling in the department to communicate with somebody else's perspective, and also making sure that you're coming in with being cognizant of the credibility that you bring to the table?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think that to build credibility, as Rich spoke about here, is that you need to be able to point back to a framework. So if you're a small company, it doesn't mean you need to go out and hire an external auditor to get you aligned with ISO 27001 or SOC 2, but it does mean that you should be able to use the free resources available out there on the internet to find a framework that works for you and your company. So if you're not really sure which one to use, you can look to your customer base. They'll usually be pounding you for a specific framework. They'll be asking you for something like a SOC 2 report over and over. So that'll indicate what you should probably start working on for your business based on the products and services that you sell. So I think that you don't need, as again, I said earlier, you don't need to overcomplicate it, but find a framework that works for you and start building controls. That doesn't mean you go and get an external auditor, but it does mean that you at least start laying the foundation for the fundamentals, as we've talked about ad nauseum during this presentation. So the access reviews, the risk register management, the vendor reviews, et cetera. And in terms of getting those teams to buy in, which, as you said, you can kind of become like a psychiatrist for the organization and different business units, to get them to really be interested in the cybersecurity program is to continually remind them of the control framework that you're working on. So you want to get the organization to a point where everybody knows that you have built your security program off of this framework, whichever one that is, whether it's COBIT or NIST, anything like that. You need to have that recognition of the name in your organization. And how do you do that? Well, in our security department, we always joke around that we're the CROs, we're the chief reminding officers. And that just means you need to literally continually remind people of the security controls that you're using. So remind people, here's why you're getting the security awareness training annually, because it's required because of this X framework. Here's why. So just continually remind people of what you've built your security program on, meaning the framework, whether it's ISO, NIST, et cetera. And then eventually, after a couple of months, people are going to say, oh yeah, I know that I need to, request access from IT using this specific access request format because I know we're undergoing a SOC 2 audit. You're going to start to get that recognition of the framework. And then you have security really built in at every business unit in your organization. It'll kind of happen naturally.
And chief reminder, that doesn't just mean, hey, make sure you tell him, mm-hmm. Right? We're called to be wise as a wolf, but harmless as a dove. Because the goal of reminding someone is not to say, well, I reminded you, I have it noted here, I did it 14 times in the last 6 months. No. How does each person best get reminded? It's sometimes a mass text, it's sometimes an email, or do you have a department that, you know what, we're going to do a 30-second video. I'm just going to do a 30-second video. Mm-hmm. So and now when we start talking about the best way to adapt, there is no better way to derail a conversation nowadays than to say, what about AI? Because that's almost like saying, tell me about your feelings.
Yeah.
Right. And we run into the issue of purposeful innovation. So when we're talking about all these frameworks and beginning to adopt technologies, because for instance, let's talk about the big pink elephant in the room, ChatGPT. Governance-wise, it is a very, very slippery slope. What would you guys like to share from the perspective of AI, ChatGPT, as open-ended question as you want to jump in at?
Okay,
I'm going to volunteer.
Okay. I think ChatGPT and advanced information gathering is the next generation of business intelligence. It has been around for a long time. It is becoming more and more usable, to the common end user. So yeah, does that affect your business? Yes, absolutely. Because now, remember when Microsoft Office first came out, and that became such a driver for PCs and for the end users experience. This is going to become an end user experience that's going to drive business intelligence. It's going to drive automation going forward. So it's another tool. And if you can put guardrails around the tool, use it properly, and not expose the business to undue risk, I think you've got something there, and I think you should work with it.
I have to agree with what Elvis was saying. The technology is there. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Okay, it's here. We're not going to stop it. So how do we take advantage of it? Business is going to look at it from their perspective of how they can utilize it to grow business or to satisfy their constituents or whatever. We have to look at it from a different perspective. We have to look at it as, okay, it can help us. We were talking earlier about we don't have enough cybersecurity professionals that are out there. So AI is going to help us to better be able to respond to the threat vectors that are coming up. Okay, it's going to have some of that intelligence that we can build in that we can only dream of getting and hiring. At the same time, we have to recognize that our adversaries are going to be using the same thing in order to try to probe and figure out how they can get in. So we are talking about an epic battle that is going to be fought in cyberspace, okay, between the two different versions of AI, those that want to use it for good, those that want to use it for bad. And we have to be able to utilize it. We cannot sit back and say, hey, I don't want to use it because, I'm threatened by it or whatever. If we don't use it to counter what's going on, we will find ourselves on the losing end of it.
I agree.
You said ethics battle. I'm going to jump on that one. So the biggest challenge today that most people are aware of is the bias within AI.
Right.
However, most of us miss the fact that how can we address the bias in AI when there is a bias in moral standards in our society? We keep trimming the tree, but at the end of the day, the roots are still attached to the ground. It's going to keep growing. And I mean, we see today, case an example. It seems that most factors of objective information are pointing at an economic downturn, except the official narrative. Now, when we look at trimming budgets and trimming costs, cybersecurity sometimes, if a senior leadership on the board level does not truly understand how security is enabling the business to do more, sometimes security budgets might be the first ones to get trimmed. What do you expect to happen to the security budget if this economic downturn continues to go the direction that is going? And as security leaders, how do we get ready for that? And how do we eliminate the brain power that goes with dealing with the element of surprise, and we just pivot objectively?
So I think you're right kind of about the current economic condition. I think that's something we really can't avoid. And so we have to be aware of it as a security department. But I think that, as we've said a couple of times already today, security it's now a business risk. So I don't expect that as we kind of enter economic uncertainty that security budgets or compliance budgets are going to be reduced. I don't see that happening because I think an organization is keeping security top of mind, regardless of what industry or vertical you're in. However, I do think that these budgets are not going to be increased over the next couple of years. So one thing that I've seen across several different user bases and across several different industries is really a desire of security departments to leverage their current tool portfolio in new ways. So instead of maybe buying a new scanner, buying a new logging tool, like maybe they would in previous fiscal years, they're now trying to say, okay, I have these 4 tools. What can I use them for beyond what I already use them for today? Or could I tune them in another way so that I can make them more effective? So I don't think that we're going to be reducing any security budgets, but certainly I don't think anybody's going to get, any more money as time goes on.
Yeah, I would
use your vendors, use your partners.
Absolutely.
I would just remind, whatever board I was talking to, is that if there is going to be any kind of an economic downturn, that means there will be more people out there who are looking for alternative mechanisms in order to generate revenue to themselves. So more bad guys and gals out there who are going to be coming after your company. Okay. As Keavy said, cybersecurity is no longer just a technical thing. It's table stakes. It's table stakes for every company. I would remind them there's no choice in the matter. Yes, you can avoid buying a new computer system in order to grow because your business is not growing, but you can't avoid, spending the money on the cybersecurity unless you're willing to roll the dice. Okay, that's just the way it's got to be, and I'm honest with them. Choice is yours.
Okay. Any thoughts on that? I know when we're talking about AI, there are always more thoughts. Keavy, what can you share? Because that is sort of an economic animal to get into, and the guinea's out of the bag, out of the lamp. Yeah. How do we jump on that? How do we leverage it? How do we make sure that a competitive advantage for someone else doesn't become our detrimental disadvantage?
Yeah, none of us want to stifle innovation, I think, because of course we want our businesses to grow, but also job security. It's, if you're saying you can't use this incredible emerging new technology to those you work with, that's not going to be a really effective approach. So I think that one thing that I've learned over my career in security is that we should be two things as a department. We should always be approachable and we should be flexible. So we should always kind of be willing to manage risk by making people want to work with the security team. So that doesn't mean say yes to everything, but it also doesn't mean say no to everything. So you make sure that data privacy is key. So you can use kind of the fundamentals of what we've talked about a little bit earlier. So make sure that when you're going to use a new AI provider, if you're going to leverage ChatGPT, did you do a vendor assessment on it? Did you make an awareness policy for your staff that outlines what you can do and what you can't do with this tool? What data are you allowed to put into it? What data are you not allowed to put into it? So you can kind of go back to those fundamentals to make sure that security as a department and kind of as a foundation in the organization is flexible and approachable. You're going to be way more effective as a leader that way.
And can you use a private, AI vendor versus an on-premise, vendor? Rich, I know that you probably in your previous life, you had a lot of constituents, a lot of departments come to you as a CISO and, hey, we need to use this new tool. And obviously you had to take a moment and pause and analyze. So I think we're also at that same stage where we need to take a moment, pause, and analyze. Is a public AI offering, is that the best offering we should be using? Or should we look at something that's a little bit more private, a little bit more controlled?
Great.
On closing arguments, guys, we have about 6 minutes. If we can have a closing argument for each one of you in regards to leveraging your resources. It's not so much about how, but it's about who. And we don't just have vendors, we have partners, we have outside advisors, we have inside advisors, and that could be another leader within another department. How do you leverage your resources all the way so you're not having to be playing octopus behind the controls against the ticking bomb that is time? How do you leverage your resources, your team, moving forward in an area that does not forgive?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Two different things: leveraging your team versus your partners that you might have out there. Organizing and structuring your team to make sure that each of them understands their roles and responsibilities and what they have got to do in order to achieve a great cybersecurity program. Developing that cybersecurity program so it's clear that what you're trying to do, what your team is responsible for. I used to use an acronym PMR, Prevention, Management, Resolution. Those are the three things that I always looked at. Okay, guys, what are we doing on the prevention front? Okay, we're doing, cybersecurity awareness. We're developing our standards. We're developing our processes. We're developing everything that we've got to do in order to prevent things from happening. So we put that up front. Management, how am I doing vulnerability assessments on the applications I'm developing? How am I doing third-party risk assessments? How am I doing those types of things during the actual, day-to-day? Keavy, you brought up the idea of we don't want to be the ones that are always saying no. So what I tried to do is always build my cybersecurity program into the day-to-day processes. So application development folks understand I got to do a vulnerability scan on your application before it goes out the door and it goes live. Don't come to me at the last minute. Let's build it into the process. And so I'm helping with the overall management of developing the application, making sure that the data, one of the other titles I had was Chief Data Officer. So understanding data and how data is used, the privacy aspects of it. And then finally, on the resolution side of things are going to happen. I told my boss, hey, you're probably going to have to fire me one day. I'm letting you know now, because that's the job I've taken on. But if I'm really good, you won't have to fire me. So what do I got to do? I got to make sure I do the prevention and the management, and then the resolution. What's my incident response plan look like? What am I doing to ensure that if it does occur, how am I going to gather the information and then learn from it, make sure it doesn't happen again? And we had problems. We did. Luckily, I didn't end up on the front cover of the New York Post, but still, we had those issues. So we dealt with them, we learned from it, we closed the holes, fixed the gaps. So PMR. And so my closing argument to everybody is, think along those lines of how to use vendors appropriately, pick the best vendors, define your team, make sure that they know their responsibilities, and make sure that your upper management knows what you're doing.
Keavy and Elvis, 1 minute closing argument.
Go ahead.
So I think in terms of leveraging your resources, make a core incident response team. Choose 5 to 10 people across the organization, not just in security, that can serve as members of an incident response program, so that when something bad does happen, these people are available and trained on what their responsibility is to be able to respond effectively. So in security, prevention is key, but sometimes you have to be reactive. So make sure that there is a group of people in your organization. Like I said, keep it small, 5 to 10. So when an incident happens, they know what to do.
I'll just echo what the panel says so far. My approach has been fundamentals, education, frameworks, and then that influences culture. If you have those first elements, if you have the right mix and you have the right savviness in yourself to talk to the business, then you can affect culture, and that in the long run will give you the resources you need going forward, even in tough times.
Thank you so much, Elvis, Keavy, Rich. You can't hide your passion. It comes across, and at the end of the day, that's the glue that brings it all together. You never stop seeking, you never stop growing. I want to thank you so much for coming here on this panel, for literally for the confident vulnerability to show that, hey, we're not supposed to have all the answers. We're supposed to know how to get them. Take a step back, look around, make a call, move forward, and you keep doing that. Rich, Keavy, and Elvis, thank you so much. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you here soon, hopefully next year.
Pablo, thank you,
Pablo.
Thank you.